everyone. In this session, we're going to explore two powerful forces that shape what organizations become over time: organizational culture and organizational change. These topics matter because they sit underneath almost everything else we study in organizational behavior. Culture influences how people interpret situations, what they pay attention to, what feels normal, what gets rewarded, what gets punished, and what kinds of behavior are seen as brave, foolish, respectful, or disruptive. And change matters because organizations don't get to choose whether the world changes around them. They only get to choose whether they adapt intentionally or drift reactively. Let's begin with culture. A simple definition is that culture is a system of shared meaning held by members that distinguishes one organization from another. Think of it as the organization's unwritten operating system. It's not a slogan on the wall, it's the pattern of assumptions people rely on when they decide what to do next. If you want to understand culture, don't look first at what leaders claim they value. Watch what people do under pressure. Notice what gets praised, what gets ignored, what gets treated as a big deal, and what gets treated as just how things are. Culture becomes visible in those moments. Organizational culture is descriptive, not evaluative. It's about how people perceive the organization's real personality. Job satisfaction asks whether people like the organization. Culture asks what kind of place it actually is. When someone says, this company is political, or here speed matters more than quality, or you can't question leaders, or people will help you when you're stuck, they are describing culture as lived experience. A helpful way to understand cultural differences is to think in terms of competing values. The Framework by Cameron and Quinn. Many organizations lean toward one of four broad orientations. Some are clan-like, internally focused and flexible, emphasizing trust, collaboration, development, and a sense of belonging. Some are adhocracy-like, externally focused and flexible, emphasizing innovation, experimentation, autonomy, and growth. Some are market-like, externally focused and stable, emphasizing achievement, competition, performance targets, and winning. And some are hierarchy-like, internally focused and stable, emphasizing rules, formalization, routines, and predictability. Most organizations are mixtures, but usually one orientation dominates, and that dominant pattern shapes what people expect from one another. Another practical lens is to describe culture through dimensions like innovation, attention to detail, decisiveness, team orientation, outcome orientation, aggressiveness, supportiveness, and emphasis on rewards. If you walk into a workplace and people debate ideas openly, take risks, and treat mistakes as learning, you're in a different cultural ecosystem than a place where mistakes trigger blame, information is guarded, and people prioritize looking competent over being curious. It's also important to recognize that culture is not always uniform. Large organizations usually have a dominant culture, which reflects the core values shared by most members, and they also have subcultures, distinct pockets that form around departments, locations, professional groups, or leadership teams. Subcultures aren't necessarily bad. Sometimes they help a unit adapt to its work reality. The challenge is when subcultures become so disconnected that coordination collapses, or when one toxic subculture becomes normalized and spreads. Now, what makes a culture strong? A strong culture is one where core values are intensely held and widely shared. People agree on what the organization stands for, and that agreement creates cohesion and clarity. Strong cultures can build loyalty and commitment. They can also make it easier to coordinate without constant supervision because people use shared norms as guidance. But strong cultures are not automatically good. A strong culture can become a liability if its values are misaligned with reality or ethics, or if the culture becomes rigid and hostile to new information. So, how do employees learn culture? This is one of the most useful parts of the topic because it's where culture becomes actionable. People learn culture through stories, rituals, symbols, and language. Stories are narratives that circulate and anchor the present in the past. Stories about founders, past crises, rule breaking heroes, humiliating failures, legendary promotions, or how we handle mistakes here are not just entertainment. They teach people what matters. They're emotionally sticky, which makes them persuasive. When a new employee hears the same kind of story repeatedly, they begin to understand what behavior is admired and what behavior is dangerous. Rituals are repeated activities that reinforce values. They might be weekly meetings, onboarding ceremonies, performance reviews, customer debriefs, or even informal traditions like how teams celebrate wins. Rituals matter because they shape attention and emotion. They can reduce anxiety by giving people a sense of control and predictability, and they can also create belonging. If a ritual consistently reinforces a value, like we speak honestly about problems, it strengthens that value. If a ritual reinforces fear, like public shaming for mistakes, it strengthens fear. Symbols are the material and visible signals of what matters. Office layout, executive perks, who gets privacy, who gets access, what tools are provided, dress code, the tone of emails, the size of meeting rooms. These things convey hierarchy, openness, and priorities. Symbols are powerful because they communicate without arguments. They tell people what is real without needing a mission statement. Language is another carrier of culture. Jargon, acronyms, and insider terms can build identity, but they can also create confusion, exclusion, and even discrimination depending on how language is used. The words an organization normalizes, like resources versus people, deliverables versus customers, alignment versus obedience, shape how members interpret the social world. Once culture exists, it tends to resist change. That doesn't mean it never changes. It means it has inertia. Culture persists because it's reinforced by three major forces: selection, top management, and socialization. Selection is not only about competence, it's also about fit. Organizations tend to hire people who align with existing values, and applicants self-select in or out based on what they perceive. This creates a reinforcing loop. The more an organization hires for fit, the more consistent the culture becomes. The upside is coherence. The downside is uniformity and rigidity, where diversity of thought is filtered out. Top management is a cultural amplifier. Leaders set norms through what they pay attention to, what they reward, what they tolerate, and how they behave when there's risk. If a leader says ethics matter but rewards people who cut corners, employees learn the real value. If leaders say innovation matters but punish every failure, employees learn to avoid risk. Culture is shaped less by speeches and more by patterns of consequences. Socialization is the process by which newcomers learn the social knowledge and skills needed to function. It often happens in stages. Before people arrive, they have expectations. When they arrive, they experience reality, and they notice whether it matches. Then, over time, they adjust. This adjustment is not only about learning tasks, it's about learning what is safe to say, when to push back, who has informal power, and what success actually looks like. Socialization can increase commitment and performance, but it can also suppress individuality if it becomes too controlling. Now let's ask, what does culture do? Culture has several functions. It defines boundaries. This is who we are and who we are not. It gives members a sense of identity. It encourages commitment to something larger than individual self-interest. It stabilizes the social system by creating predictability, and it functions as a sense-making and control mechanism. In decentralized organizations, culture can become even more important because when formal control systems are reduced, shared meaning helps people coordinate. Culture becomes the invisible manager. But culture doesn't operate only as abstract values. It becomes tangible through climate. Climate is the shared perception employees have about what is rewarded and supported in the work environment. You can think of climate as culture made visible in daily practices. For example, a safety climate exists when people perceive that safety is genuinely prioritized, not just mentioned. A justice climate exists when people perceive fairness in decisions. A diversity climate exists when people perceive inclusion as real. Climate matters because it predicts attitudes and behaviors, and it translates values into experience. This is where one of the most important distinctions appears: the difference between espoused values and enacted values. Espoused values are what leaders say the organization believes. Enacted values are what employees actually observe. When there is alignment, employees feel trust and clarity. When there is misalignment, say leaders talk about well-being but reward non-stop overwork, employees become cynical. And cynicism is one of the fastest ways to erode engagement, voice, and innovation. Culture can be an asset. It can improve coordination, motivation, and performance, and it can become part of a strong organizational identity that attracts talent. But culture can also be a liability. It can create stagnation and entrenchment where consistency becomes an obstacle to adaptation. It can create uniformity and rigidity that suppress the benefits of diversity. It can become toxic, where dysfunctional norms like fear, bullying, or abusive competition become normalized and self-reinforcing. It can create culture clashes in mergers and acquisitions, where integration fails not because strategy is wrong, but because shared meaning doesn't match. Let's talk specifically about three cultural directions organizations often try to build deliberately: positive cultures, ethical cultures, and innovative cultures. A positive culture emphasizes building on strengths, rewarding more than punishing, and encouraging vitality and growth. A positive culture is not one that pretends problems don't exist. It's one that tries to expand what works, recognizes people as capable of development, and uses recognition wisely. A key practice is catching people doing something right. Praise is not trivial. It is a form of attention, and attention shapes behavior. An ethical culture is one where clear ethical standards are modeled, communicated, trained, rewarded, and protected. Ethical culture starts at the top, but it becomes real through systems, training, transparent expectations, consequences for unethical behavior, and protective mechanisms for people who speak up. When leaders consistently behave ethically and reinforce ethics, that expectation cascades. When leaders pressure results at any cost, unethical behavior becomes more likely, sometimes even among people who see themselves as good. Ethical culture is not just about individual morality. It's about the environment that shapes choices. An innovative culture is typically supported by a more organic structure, meaningful rewards, slack resources that allow experimentation, and strong communication across units. Innovation thrives where people are encouraged to try, where mistakes are treated as learning, where there is a shared vision, and where idea champions actively advocate for new approaches and help them gain traction. Innovation is social. Good ideas often need champions because organizations default to the familiar. Now let's shift into change. Change simply means things become different than they were. But in organizational life, change is rarely neutral. Change redistributes resources, attention, status, and influence. That's why change triggers emotion. Even if a change is objectively sensible, it can still feel threatening because it often implies loss of competence, loss of routine, loss of power, loss of relationships, or loss of identity. Change can be planned or unplanned. Planned change is proactive, intentional, and goal-oriented. It aims to improve the organization's ability to adapt and to change employee behavior in ways that support performance. Planned change often involves change agents, people who catalyze change and take responsibility for managing it. Change agents can be managers, employees, or external consultants. And one reason change agents fail is that they underestimate resistance. Resistance is not just stubbornness. Resistance is often a rational response to perceived threat or uncertainty. It can be individual, rooted in habits, fear of the unknown, economic concerns, and selective perception. And it can be organizational, rooted in structural inertia, group norms, limited focus of change, threats to expertise or power relationships, and resource allocation patterns. It's also important to notice that resistance can sometimes be useful. Resistance can signal real flaws in a change plan. It can force debate that improves the quality of decisions. The problem is not resistance itself. It's unmanaged resistance that becomes sabotage or disengagement. So, how do leaders overcome resistance? There are several tactics, and the best leaders choose based on context rather than using a single style. Communication matters, but not as propaganda. People want a rationale that feels fair and that considers stakeholders, not just shareholders. Vague messages breed suspicion. Honest communication reduces uncertainty and helps people make sense of what is happening. Participation reduces resistance when participants have meaningful expertise and influence. When people help shape a change, they tend to feel ownership rather than imposition. Participation also improves change quality because frontline employees often understand operational realities better than top leaders do. Support and commitment matter because change is emotional. People don't process change only cognitively, they also adjust psychologically. Support can include training, resources, coaching, and a climate where questions are not punished. Relationships matter as well. People accept changes more readily when they trust the change agents and see them as legitimate. Trust is not built by insisting that change is good. Trust is built through consistency, fairness, competence, and care. Fairness is one of the most powerful levers in change. Even when outcomes are painful, people cope better when the process feels fair. When procedures are consistent, explanations are truthful, voices are heard, and decisions do not look arbitrary. There are also more cynical tactics, like manipulation and co-optation, where leaders try to gain support by strategically involving opponents or managing information. These can work short term, but they can backfire severely if people feel tricked. Selecting people who accept change can help. Some individuals are more adaptable, emotionally stable, and willing to take risks, but relying on selection alone can be simplistic. Often, the real issue is that the organization is asking people to change without giving them capacity to change. Coercion, threats, and pressure tends to backfire long term. It may produce compliance, but it rarely produces commitment, and change without commitment is fragile. Now we need to address something that makes change particularly hard: the politics of change. Change threatens the status quo, and the status quo protects someone's advantages. So change tends to trigger political behavior, coalition building, influencing narratives, controlling information, and protecting turf. Leaders who have invested years building power within the existing system can become major impediments, not necessarily because they are bad people, but because change threatens what they have built. If you want to manage change effectively, you must manage the political landscape. That means mapping stakeholders, understanding interests, anticipating resistance points, and building coalitions rather than assuming that logic alone will persuade. Let's look at a few well-known approaches to managing change. One classic approach is Lewin's three-step model: unfreezing, moving, and refreezing. Unfreezing means disrupting the equilibrium, helping people see that the current state is not sustainable and loosening old habits and norms. Movement is the transition to a desired state, new processes, behaviors, structures, or mindsets. Refreezing means stabilizing the new state so it becomes the new normal. The model is useful because it reminds us that change is not only implementation, it's also letting go and then reinforcing. But modern organizations often struggle with the refreezing idea because environments keep shifting. Sometimes there is no stable end state, only continuous adaptation. Another approach is in Kotter's 8-step view of change that emphasizes building urgency, forming coalitions, creating a vision, communicating it, removing barriers, creating short-term wins, consolidating gains, and anchoring changes in culture. The value here is realism. Major change requires momentum. It needs both leadership and broad buy-in. Short-term wins are especially important because they reduce cynicism and build belief that change is possible. Action research is a more data-driven change approach. Diagnose, analyze, feedback, action, and evaluate. The core idea is that you don't change based on assumptions alone. You gather data, interpret it with stakeholders, choose interventions, and then evaluate results. This approach often reduces resistance because people feel the change is grounded in reality and that they were involved in interpreting what is actually happening. Organizational development is a family of change methods that focus on improving effectiveness and employee well-being through participative processes and inquiry. That includes things like process consultation, where a consultant helps a team understand interpersonal and process dynamics; team building, where groups develop trust, openness, and coordination; intergroup development, where departments address stereotypes and conflict; and appreciative inquiry, which builds change by identifying strengths and imagining what the organization could become at its best. Appreciative inquiry, in particular, is a useful counterbalance to deficit-based change efforts because organizations often exhaust people by focusing only on problems. Strength-based change can energize, but it still must remain honest and not drift into forced positivity. Finally, there's a deeper idea that many leaders only learn the hard way. Change is paradoxical. There is rarely a final optimal state. Organizations must balance tensions: stability and flexibility, control and autonomy, efficiency and innovation, short-term results and long-term capacity. As conditions shift, different elements become more important, and leaders must adjust. The most effective leaders think holistically and accept that managing change is not a one-time project, but an ongoing practice of balancing competing demands. So if we pull this together, what should you remember as master's level students preparing for leadership, consulting, or advanced organizational roles? First, culture is real and measurable in its consequences, even if it feels intangible. It shapes behavior through shared meaning and through what people perceive is rewarded. Second, culture is transmitted through stories, rituals, symbols, and language, not just through policies. Third, culture can be a strategic asset, but it can also be a trap. Strong cultures provide cohesion, but they can also become rigid, toxic, or unethical. Fourth, Change is difficult, not because people are irrational, but because change threatens resources, identity, and stability, and because organizations have built in inertia. Fifth, effective change requires more than announcing a plan. It requires sense making, fairness, participation, support, coalition building, and attention to politics. And finally, there is no permanent finish line. Healthy organizations build the capability to adapt repeatedly without destroying trust, dignity, or performance. The long term winners are not the organizations that avoid change, they are the organizations that learn how to change while keeping people aligned, engaged, and psychologically able to do their best work. That's the heart of culture and change. Shared meaning shapes behavior, and managing change is largely the art of reshaping shared meaning in a way people can understand, accept, and live out in the real world. Thank you for joining me.